For nearly a century, the massive oak tree stood proudly in the corner of the Johnson family's yard. Its branches stretched across the lawn like protective arms, offering shade during summer afternoons and dropping golden leaves each fall that blanketed the neighborhood in warm color. Generations of children had played beneath it, carving initials into its bark and building rope swings that swayed gently in the breeze. To the Johnsons, the oak wasn't just a tree. It was part of their family's story, a living monument that had stood through wars, storms, and the ever-changing faces of the street. But the oak's very existence soon became the center of conflict. At the head of the neighborhood's homeowners association was Richard Crane, a man who took pride in enforcing every rule with an iron fist. He saw himself less as a community leader and more as a warden, watching over lawns, fences, paint colors, and anything else that might offend his sense of uniform perfection. To him, the oak was not a majestic treasure, but a nuisance. Its roots stretched near the sidewalk, cracking the concrete. Its wide branches extended beyond the Johnsons' yard, dropping acorns on neighbors' cars and scattering leaves into gutters. For years, Richard had complained about the tree in board meetings, muttering about hazards and liabilities. Most neighbors ignored him, too fond of the oak to support its removal. But over time, Richard tightened his grip on the HOA, rallying like-minded board members who shared his obsession with control. When new rules were passed requiring all trees within a certain distance from sidewalks to be cut down, everyone knew the real target. The Johnsons received the official notice in their mailbox one crisp morning. Their beloved oak had to go. The family was devastated. The notice read like a death sentence, citing community safety concerns and aesthetic uniformity as reasons. It gave them 30 days to comply or face steep daily fines. The Johnsons pleaded their case, sending letters and attending meetings, but Richard was unmoved. He reminded them of the bylaws, his voice cold and final. To him, there was no room for exceptions. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors sympathized, whispering that it was unfair, but others shrugged and accepted Richard's decision as inevitable. The Johnsons, however, held out hope. They tried contacting city officials, hoping to get the tree declared a historic landmark, but time was against them. The paperwork dragged and the fines began. When the day finally came, it was one the Johnsons would never forget. A crew of workers arrived early in the morning with chainsaws, ropes, and trucks. Neighbors gathered quietly on sidewalks, watching as the family stood in their yard, helpless. The sound of the chainsaw tore through the air, sharp and merciless. Branch by branch, piece by piece, the century-old oak was dismantled. Its wide canopy shrank, its mighty trunk was sliced apart, and in a matter of hours, what had once been a towering guardian of the neighborhood lay in piles of wood and sawdust. The Johnsons were heartbroken. The stump left behind looked like a scar in the earth, a reminder of what had been lost. But for Richard Crane, however, it was a victory. He walked past that day with his usual smug expression, satisfied that he had once again bent the neighborhood to his will. He saw compliance where others saw devastation, order where others saw grief. But nature has a way of keeping balance. As the days passed, the air turned heavy with the kind of heat that warned of storms to come. Dark clouds gathered in the distance, and whispers of an approaching front began circulating. No one could have predicted what would happen next, least of all Richard Crane, who believed he had finally triumphed over the Johnsons and their tree. The oak was gone, but its absence set the stage for something far greater than anyone imagined. And when the storm finally arrived, it would not spare those who had demanded its destruction. The neighborhood felt strangely hollow in the days after the oak was cut down. Where once there had been shade and life, there was now an empty patch of sky and a raw stump left behind. The Johnsons avoided looking at it, though it was impossible to miss. Their yard felt exposed, unprotected, and stripped of the character that had always set it apart. Every glance out the window was a reminder of what the HOA had forced upon them.
For Richard Crane, the HOA president, the absence of the oak was a personal triumph. He drove past the Johnsons' property slowly, surveying the stump as though it was a monument to his authority. To him, it wasn't about safety or liability, though that was the justification he'd used. It was about power. The oak had represented defiance, and its removal had proven that no one could stand against the rules he so carefully enforced. He boasted about it in board meetings, holding it up as an example of what happened when homeowners challenged his authority. But even as Richard reveled in his victory, nature was stirring. The late summer air grew heavier each day, thick with humidity that clung to skin and made the nights restless. Local forecasts warned of severe weather patterns forming, though storms were nothing unusual for the region. Still, there was an unease among some of the residents, an instinctive sense that this storm would be different. The air itself seemed charged, as if the neighborhood was holding its breath. The Johnsons felt it more than most. They would sit on their porch in the evenings, staring at the empty space where the oak had once stood, and notice how much hotter their yard had become without its shade. Sunlight blazed down unfiltered, baking the ground and withering their plants. The grass browned faster, and their air conditioner worked overtime to cool the house. In those small daily inconveniences, they felt the weight of their loss. Yet there was something else, something more ominous. The yard didn't just look different. It felt different, as though the absence of the oak had shifted the balance of the land. Neighbors began to whisper about karma. Some said that cutting down a tree that had stood for 100 years was bound to invite misfortune. Others muttered that Richard Crane had gone too far this time, that his obsession with rules would come back to haunt him. These whispers were quiet, never spoken to his face, but they grew louder each time he strutted through the neighborhood, clipboard in hand, searching for his next target. Then came the night when the sky split open. Black clouds rolled in faster than anyone expected, swallowing the last rays of sunlight. The wind rose with a suddenness that rattled windows and bent street signs. Power lines swayed dangerously as lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the neighborhood in bursts of white. Rain hammered rooftops, drenching the streets in sheets of water that overwhelmed gutters and drains. Inside their homes, families huddled together, listening to the roar of the storm. The Johnsons couldn't help but think of the oak, remembering how it had always stood firm during storms of the past. Its roots had been deep, its trunk sturdy, a shield against the worst of the weather. Now, without it, their yard looked vulnerable and bare as wind tore through unbroken. But the storm's fury seemed to have another target in mind. The wind shifted suddenly, howling louder, and in the Crane household, Richard stared nervously through his window at the massive trees in his own yard. Unlike the Johnsons' oak, which had been healthy and strong, Richard's trees were shallow-rooted ornamentals he had never maintained properly. Their trunks leaned under the force of the wind, branches snapping and scattering across the lawn. Neighbors would later recall how in the heart of the storm, one sound rose above the rest, a low, cracking groan that carried through the wind and rain. It was the sound of roots tearing from the ground, of something massive giving way. Then, with a thunderous crash that shook the street, one of Richard's trees toppled, ripping up his pristine lawn and shattering part of his driveway. The irony was impossible to ignore. Richard had forced the Johnsons to cut down their century-old oak for the sake of safety. Yet within days, his own yard became the stage for nature's revenge. And the storm wasn't finished. The damage had only begun. And Richard Crane was about to learn that no HOA rule could stand against the power of nature. When morning arrived, the neighborhood woke to destruction. The storm had been brief but violent, leaving branches scattered, shingles torn loose, and trash bins overturned. But the worst of it was found in the yard of Richard Crane. the HOA president who had fought so hard to remove the Johnson's oak. His once manicured property looked like a battlefield. A massive tree lay sprawled across the center of his lawn, its roots wrenched violently from the earth, leaving a crater where soil had been torn upward. The driveway was cracked where the trunk had landed, blocking his garage and splintering the concrete he had boasted about keeping spotless. The tree's branches reached into his flower beds, crushing the roses he meticulously trimmed, and its leaves were plastered across his porch like a mocking banner of defeat. Neighbors stepped out cautiously, surveying the damage to their own homes before drifting toward Richard's property. It was impossible not to stare. Many of them still remembered the sight of the Johnsons' oak being cut down just days earlier. The irony was too sharp to ignore, and whispers quickly spread. Some muttered that it was karma. Others simply shook their heads at the cruel coincidence. To the Johnsons, watching from across the street, it felt like nature itself had answered Richard's arrogance. Richard, however, saw no irony. He stormed out of his house, red-faced and furious, barking orders at the cleanup crew he immediately called. His anger was less about the destruction itself and more about the humiliation of having his perfect property ruined. He despised the way neighbors lingered to watch, their eyes filled with curiosity and something he interpreted as smug satisfaction. He had built his reputation on control, on enforcing order, and now his own yard was chaos for all to see. But the tree had caused more than cosmetic damage. As workers began cutting into the fallen trunk, they discovered its roots had wrapped tightly around underground pipes, snapping them during the fall. Water pooled quickly, flooding part of Richard's yard and seeping toward the foundation of his house. The driveway would need to be torn up completely, and his insurance company warned that repairs could take weeks if not months. For a man who prided himself on appearances, the thought of living with such a mess gnawed at him. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Neighbors remembered how Richard had stood over the Johnsons with smug satisfaction as their oak was cut down. Now, some said, it seemed the universe had delivered a lesson in humility. Others noted the difference in circumstances. The Johnsons' oak was healthy and strong, while Richard's trees were shallow-rooted and weak, ignored until it was too late. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The Johnsons, though quietly sympathetic to the devastation, couldn't help but feel a bitter sense of justice. They hadn't wanted Richard to suffer, but his refusal to listen, his eagerness to destroy something beautiful, and his arrogance in enforcing rules had led directly to this moment. For years, he had made neighbors fear his clipboard and his letters of violation. Now, he was the one with a noticeworthy disaster right in his own front yard. As the days went by, the storm's damage took on a life of its own in the community's conversations. Richard's downfall became the subject of late-night talks on porches and whispered exchanges at mailboxes. Neighbors who had once stayed silent about his behavior now felt emboldened, finding satisfaction in the poetic justice of the situation. For once, Richard wasn't the one holding power. He was the one under scrutiny. But Richard was not a man who accepted defeat easily. The more people whispered, the more he seethed. He doubled down on his efforts to restore order, even as his property remained a wreck. He filed complaints against neighbors for untrimmed hedges, faded paint, or cracked driveways, things he had ignored before but now weaponized to reassert dominance. His actions only fueled the growing resentment against him. And in the Johnsons' hearts, a thought began to root. Maybe the storm wasn't just an accident. Maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something larger. A shift in the balance of power within the neighborhood. The oak was lost, but in its absence, something else was rising. What no one realized yet was that Richard's battle with the storm's aftermath was only the start. Nature had already humbled him once, but the neighborhood itself was about to turn in ways he could never control.
The days following the storm brought a shift in the neighborhood's atmosphere. What had once been a community tightly monitored under Richard Crane's iron grip now carried an air of quiet rebellion. His fallen tree was more than just storm damage. It was a symbol. Where neighbors had once been intimidated by his letters and fines, they now whispered more openly about his hypocrisy. The president of the HOA, the enforcer of rules, had become the man with the worst yard on the street. Richard, however, refused to acknowledge the shift. He doubled down on his authority, walking the neighborhood with his clipboard as though nothing had changed. He handed out violation notices for weeds creeping between sidewalk cracks, for paint that had faded under the summer sun, even for mailboxes that leaned slightly after the storm's winds. His actions only fueled resentment. Neighbors who once grudgingly complied began to feel united in their frustration. His obsession with control, once tolerated, now looked petty against the backdrop of his own ruined lawn. The Johnsons watched this unfold with mixed emotions. They still grieved the loss of their oak, but the sight of Richard's empire cracking brought them a quiet, guilty satisfaction. For years, their tree had been a gathering place for the neighborhood children, a piece of history everyone shared in some small way. Its forced removal had hurt more than just their family, and now, with Richard's downfall, people began to talk about what they had lost. Conversations shifted from whispers of karma to serious questions about whether the HOA was serving the neighborhood or just serving Richard. At the next board meeting, those cracks became visible. Attendance was higher than usual, with homeowners filling the small clubhouse, their voices sharper and their patience thinner. When Richard opened the meeting, insisting on discussing the removal of storm debris and restoration of neighborhood order, several residents interrupted. They questioned the fairness of recent violation notices, pointing out that Richard himself had not addressed the damage on his own property. Others brought up the Johnsons' oak, asking why a tree that had stood strong for a century was deemed dangerous, while Richard's neglected trees had posed the real threat. Richard bristled at the criticism, deflecting blame and clinging to the bylaws as though they were scripture. He reminded everyone that rules were rules, and without them, the community would descend into chaos. But the room no longer echoed with agreement. Instead, murmurs of discontent spread. For the first time, Richard's authority was openly challenged, and though the meeting ended without a resolution, the damage to his power was undeniable. Outside the meeting, neighbors gathered in clusters, sharing their frustrations. Some suggested drafting a petition to remove Richard as HOA president. Others simply agreed that the association had gone too far under his leadership. The storm had not only uprooted his tree, it had uprooted the trust and compliance that kept him in control. Richard sensed the rebellion, but refused to admit defeat. He saw the neighborhood's shifting mood as a personal attack, a conspiracy against him. His paranoia grew, and so did his desperation. He began sending out more notices, hoping to overwhelm residents into compliance. Instead, his actions backfired. Families who once suffered in silence now compared letters, laughed at the absurdity of his demands, and began ignoring his threats altogether. Meanwhile, the Johnsons found themselves at the center of this quiet revolution. Neighbors who had avoided confrontation now came to their porch, expressing regret over the loss of the oak and sharing their anger at how Richard had treated them. For the first time in years, the Johnsons felt less isolated. Their grief transformed into a rallying point for the community. And as summer deepened into autumn, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath again. Nature had already delivered one blow to Richard Crane, but storms were not the only force of change. People, when pushed far enough, could become just as powerful. Richard had no idea how close he was to losing everything he had built.
By the time autumn settled over the neighborhood,
Richard Crane's authority had crumbled to its weakest point. What had once been a community kept rigidly in line by fear of fines and letters had transformed into something different, resistant, vocal, and emboldened. His pristine reputation had been buried under the wreckage of his storm-toppled tree, and no amount of clipboard inspections could restore it. His yard remained a scar on the street. Despite his attempts to clean it up, the crater left by the uprooted roots gaped like an open wound. The cracked driveway sprawled in jagged lines, and his flower beds lay in ruin. Insurance adjusters dragged their feet, contractors delayed, and every passing day kept his property in a state of disrepair. For a man who prided himself on perfection, the humiliation was unbearable. Neighbors who had once scrambled to meet his impossible standards now walked past his house slowly, taking in the sight as though it were a public monument to hypocrisy. Behind closed doors, meetings of frustrated homeowners became more organized. What began as small conversations after HOA board sessions turned into regular gatherings in living rooms and backyards. The Johnsons often hosted these, their porch becoming a safe space where neighbors vented about years of unnecessary rules and fines. The oak, though gone, became the symbol of what they had lost under Richard's leadership. Its absence reminded everyone of the price of silence. Soon, whispers grew into action. A petition to remove Richard Crane from his position as HOA president circulated quietly but steadily. Signatures piled up, faster than anyone anticipated. Families who had endured his endless notices, seniors who had been fined for flower colors, parents scolded for toys left in yards, all signed with relief and determination. The petition didn't just represent frustration with Richard, it represented a shift in power, a collective decision that enough was enough. Richard sensed the tide turning. He noticed clusters of neighbors talking, noticed doors closing when he approached, noticed fewer and fewer people responding to his violation letters. His paranoia intensified. He believed the Johnsons were behind it all, orchestrating some personal vendetta. In his mind, the fallen tree wasn't karma or coincidence, it was the beginning of a coordinated attack against him. The more he believed it, the more desperate his actions became. In a final attempt to regain control, Richard called for a special HOA meeting. He declared it mandatory, sending notices that threatened fines for non-attendance. His hope was to reassert dominance, to remind the neighborhood that he was still in charge. But when the night of the meeting came, the clubhouse filled with faces that no longer feared him. He stood at the front, posture rigid, voice sharp, lecturing about order and discipline, about how rules had to be followed for the sake of the community. But his words fell flat. Instead of nods and silence, he was met with raised voices, questions, and outright defiance. Neighbors demanded accountability for his own property's state of disrepair. Others demanded explanations for why their lives had been micromanaged while his failures went unchecked. Then, someone produced the petition. It was read aloud, every signature announced like a nail in the coffin of his reign. The room buzzed with energy, years of frustration spilling into the open. For Richard, it was the nightmare he had always feared, losing control, losing power, losing the authority that defined his very identity. He tried to fight back, calling the petition invalid, declaring it a personal attack, insisting that the bylaws made his leadership untouchable. But his voice was drowned out by the collective will of the neighborhood. The vote to remove him was overwhelming. In a single evening, the man who ruled with fear for years was stripped of his title. When Richard left the clubhouse that night, he was no longer the HOA president. He was just another homeowner, his clipboard useless, his rules ignored. The neighborhood he once commanded had turned its back on him, and the echoes of his authority vanished into the autumn air. But while the community celebrated the end of his reign, Richard himself was not finished. Humiliated, bitter, and stripped of power, He retreated into his damaged home with resentment burning in his chest. And in that silence, resentment had a way of festering into something darker. The neighborhood thought it was free, but Richard Crane's story was not yet over.
The removal of Richard Crane as HOA president was a turning point for the neighborhood. For the first time in years, families felt a sense of freedom on their own properties. Kids left bicycles in driveways without fear of fines. Porch swings creaked late into the evening as neighbors gathered to share conversations instead of complaints. Gardens bloomed in colors once deemed non-compliant, and laughter replaced the tension that had hung over the community for so long. For the Johnsons, life slowly regained a sense of peace. The empty space where their oak had once stood still ached in their hearts, but the bitterness eased as they watched the community rally around them. Neighbors planted flowers at the edge of the stump as a quiet tribute, and children played in their yard again, filling the space with the kind of joy the oak had once nurtured. The Johnsons knew they could never replace what was lost, but they also knew the tree's legacy had sparked change. Its absence had ended Richard Crane's reign. Meanwhile, Richard withdrew further into his home. Stripped of his title, he wandered the remains of his yard like a man haunted. The fallen tree's stump still marred his lawn, the cracked driveway unfixed, the crater in the ground left open like a wound he refused to heal. Neighbors passed by without acknowledging him, their conversations shifting to new projects and collective plans that excluded him entirely. The man who had once dictated the smallest details of their lives was now invisible. But Richard couldn't let go. He brooded over what he saw as betrayal, convinced the neighborhood had turned against him out of spite rather than justice. Each day as he stared from his windows, his bitterness grew. He imagined ways to reclaim his influence, ways to prove he was right. But his yard told the truth that he refused to face. His neglect, his arrogance, and his obsession with control had brought him here. Then, as if nature wanted to seal its message, another storm rolled across the horizon. This one wasn't as violent as the first, but it carried a steady, relentless wind and rain that battered the houses through the night. By morning, Richard's property had suffered again. Loose soil from the crater turned into muddy streams that washed across his lawn. Weakened branches from his remaining trees snapped and scattered, leaving his yard littered with debris. Water seeped deeper into the cracks of his driveway, widening them further. The neighborhood hardly noticed the new damage. While others cleared their sidewalks and tidied their yards, Richard's property sank further into disarray. His decline was no longer news. It was simply the reality of a man who had fallen out of step with the community around him. What had once been poetic justice had now become a lasting condition. Nature had reclaimed its balance, and Richard had been left behind. In the weeks that followed, the HOA reorganized under new leadership. Rules were softened, fines reduced, and the focus shifted from punishment to improvement. The neighborhood thrived in ways it hadn't in years. Houses looked brighter, yards felt more welcoming, and the sense of community grew stronger with every passing day. The Johnsons, once victims of the HOA's overreach, found themselves at the center of this renewal. Their loss had ignited change, and though the oak was gone, its spirit lingered in the resilience of the people it had shaded for so long. As for Richard, he remained alone in his crumbling fortress of resentment. His downfall was complete, not because of the neighbors he tried to control, but because of the forces he could never conquer. Nature had spoken twice, once through the storm that toppled his tree, and again through the quiet erosion of his authority. He ignored its balance, cut down what was strong and lasting, and placed his faith in shallow roots. And in the end, those shallow roots betrayed him. The Johnsons often looked at the stump in their yard and thought of the irony. The oak was taken from them, but its absence had changed everything for the better. Richard had wanted control over the neighborhood, but in the end, nature had taken control over him. The story of the oak became legend on their street. Neighbors retold it as a tale of arrogance,
justice, and the quiet power of the natural world. Children who once played beneath its branches now grew up hearing its story, learning that some things stand taller than rules, taller than power, even taller than pride. And so the neighborhood moved forward, stronger, freer, and wiser. The oak was gone, but its roots still lived in the spirit of the community. Nature had the final word.